This is the video lesson for Mark chapter 2. One of the things we see in the story of the gospel is that there are tensions that develop between Jesus and the religious leaders, particularly the scribes, the Pharisees, and the Sadducees and the priests. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that Jesus did not seem to approve of their practices. Their practices, particularly those of the Pharisees, had gotten very legalistic at that point. And the other reason was that Jesus made remarkable claims for himself. And those claims raised a lot of questions for the religious leadership. And we see this develop in Mark chapter 2. Mark chapter 2 starts with a wonderful story. It is about the healing of a young man who was paralyzed. Jesus was teaching in a house. There was no room for anybody to even get close to Jesus. That's how packed the room was and the house was. So this person who was paralyzed had 4 friends. We suspect these are young men because this is the kind of thing a group of young guys would think of. They go up on the roof, which would have been a flat roof made from thatch and tile. They remove the tiles, they remove the thatch, and they lower their young friend right in front of Jesus through the roof rafters. And Jesus says something very interesting to him. He says, "My son, your sins are forgiven you." Well, this raises a lot of questions with the Pharisees. They say, well, who does he think he is? Who can forgive sins but God? Well, of course, they're right about that. Who can forgive sins but God? But Jesus says to them, well, which is harder to do? Forgive someone's sins, or say, rise up and take up your bed and walk? Well, neither of those are possible for us to do. We couldn't do either of those. But Jesus says, so that you will know that I have the authority to forgive sins. He looks at the young man and he says, take up your bed and go home. And the man does exactly that. He picks up his bed, he's able to walk, he walks out, and the people are completely amazed. Well, so that's the first story in Mark chapter 2. The second story is the call of Levi. This is the call of Matthew. He's called Levi here, but in the Gospel of Matthew, he is Matthew. This is clearly the same person, and this is a person who will become one of the 12 apostles. Now, Levi he's a tax collector. He's sitting at the tax collector's table. Jesus simply comes up and says, "Follow me." And Levi gets up from the table and he follows after Jesus. Now, what's interesting is that evening he invites Jesus to dinner at his house, and the Pharisees and the scribes again are there. They've come to see what's going on, and they say, Jesus is spending all this time with sinners. He's not spending that much time with us. We're religious leaders. He's spending his time with people that we know are sinners. And Jesus has a wonderful comment that really is going to describe his ministry. He said, those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I have come to call not the righteous, but sinners. So that is going to describe Jesus' ministry. He is going to call those that are, he has come for those who are aware that they need God's help and forgiveness and grace. The third story in Mark chapter 2 is a story about fasting. The disciples of John the Baptist and the Pharisees tended to fast. They said to Jesus, why don't your disciples fast? And Jesus has an interesting comment. He says, well, the wedding party can't fast. They can't mourn. They can't be sad when the bridegroom's with them. And Jesus is comparing himself not to part of the member of the wedding party, not to the crowd, but he is the bridegroom. He is someone very special. And then he has a very, very interesting comment at the end. He says, and no one puts new wine into old wineskins, otherwise the wine will burst the skins and the wine is lost. So are the skins, but one puts new wine into fresh wineskins. In other words, Jesus is saying something new is breaking in, something new is happening. I am inaugurating something new, and it's got to have a new form along with it. So the final story in Mark chapter 2 is one about, one in which there's conflict between Jesus and the religious leaders. The disciples are going through a grain field and they start picking the heads of grain to eat. This was allowed by the law. You could pick grain as you walked through someone's grain field. You couldn't harvest someone else's field, but you could pick grain if you were hungry. It was one of the ways that the law provided for those who were poor and provided for them something to eat. But the Pharisees had decided this was not appropriate on the Sabbath because it constituted reaping, and that constituted work. So they complained to Jesus about it, and Jesus gives an Old Testament example of a time when David broke the law for a more important purpose. And then Jesus says this a wonderful comment: the Sabbath was made for people and not people for the Sabbath. That is, the purpose of the Sabbath is not that we keep it legalistically, but the reason the Sabbath is given to us, it's given to us so that we will have time to learn about God, reflect upon God, rest, and grow in our faith. And then finally, Jesus ends with this comment. He says, "So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." This must have been a comment that drove the religious leaders absolutely crazy. Jesus says, "And I have authority even over the Sabbath." Well, Jesus is certainly making remarkable claims about himself. He claims to be able to forgive sins. He calls disciples. He says that he is the bridegroom, and he is inaugurating a new day in God's economy and God's kingdom, and he is Lord of the Sabbath. Well, if he's not God, these claims certainly are outrageous. But if Jesus is the Son of God, and of course we know that he is, these claims are completely appropriate. Well, that's a little commentary on Mark chapter 2, so go and read Mark chapter 2, and we will see you after that in the video for Mark chapter 3.